The dead queen sent for me on a morning 3 years after she was buried, and I have never been able to explain that sentence to anyone without watching their face change. It came as a small thing, the way the largest things in a palace always do. I was standing my post at the foot of the east stair in Harrowgate Palace, in the grey hour before the household woke, when old Hesper, who had kept the late queen's private rooms shut and dustless since the day of the funeral, crossed the empty hall toward me with something cupped in both her hands. She was a narrow, bent woman with a face like a folded letter, and in 20 years of service I had never once seen her hurry. She hurried now. She stopped a pace from me, which no servant did to a guard on station, and she looked up at me with eyes that had clearly not slept, and she said, "Sergeant Vael, she left this for you. She made me swear to wait 3 years and to give it to no one else, and to give it to you only when you were alone." I did not move. A guard at his post does not move. It is the first thing they teach you and the last thing you forget. But something in me went very still in a different way than the discipline, a stillness that came from underneath the trained one, and I said, keeping my voice low, "Who left it, Hesper?" "You know who," she said. "The good queen, Queen Ellenore. God keep her." I should tell you, before I go further, that there are 2 queens in this story, and you must not confuse them, because the whole of what follows turns on the love one bore me and the danger the other never knew she was in. Queen Ellenore was the old queen, the grandmother of the realm, who had reigned over the Kingdom of Eldermoor for 40 years, and died gently in her sleep 3 winters before that grey morning, mourned by every soul from the high court to the cattle roads. Queen Saralind is the queen now, Eleanor's granddaughter, young and warm and far stronger than her enemies took her for, and it was Saralind, and Saralind's 2 small children, the Princess Maelin and the Prince Joran, who were in danger that morning, though none of us yet knew it, least of all me. Hesper put the thing into my white-gloved hands and folded my fingers over it as though she were afraid the air itself might take it, and then she was gone back across the hall before I had drawn another breath, and I stood at my post with the dead queen's last gift in my palm and forbade myself, by long habit, to look at it until my watch was done. It was a packet of stiff old paper, folded many times into a square no larger than a playing card, sealed with a blot of green wax. Pressed into the wax was not the great seal of the realm, which any clerk in the palace could have stamped, but a small private device the late queen had used for letters to her oldest friends, a single tower with a candle burning in its highest window. I had seen that seal exactly twice in my life, both times on commendations she had signed with her own hand, and the sight of it now made the back of my neck go cold, because it meant the thing had truly come from her, and from no one pretending to be her. I will tell you what I was, so you understand why she chose me, because I have asked myself that question more nights than I can count, and I think at last I know the answer. I am Corin Vael, Sergeant of the Harrowgate Palace Guard. I am not a clever man in the way the court counts cleverness. I cannot turn a phrase to win a room. I have no land and no name worth bowing to, and I have spent the better part of my life learning to do one thing very well, which is to stand still and watch and keep my mouth shut and miss nothing. That last part is the whole of it. The court is full of men who can be charmed into looking away. I am not one of them. The late queen knew that about me. Long ago, when I was young and green and had been on the wall a single year, I had noticed something small and wrong on a night the rest of the watch had nodded through. A window unlatched that should have been barred. A thing too small to name and too clear to ignore, and I had reported it, and it had mattered, and from that night on the old queen had marked me. Not with favor, with trust, which is a heavier thing and a lonelier one. She used to walk the gardens at dawn when she could not sleep, and once or twice across the years she had stopped where I stood my post and spoken to me plainly, as one tired person to another, about the weight of guarding a thing you love. "The danger to a crown is never the loud man at the gate, Corin," she told me once. "We see him coming. The danger is the quiet door no one remembers. Watch the quiet doors." I had not understood her. I thought it was the way old people talk, in riddles that mean nothing but their own weariness. I understand her now. God help me, I understand her now. My watch ended at the 7th bell. I was relieved by young Tamsin Caro, a guard not yet 2 years on the wall, eager and good and not yet taught to be afraid of the right things, and I gave her the post in the proper words and walked, unhurried, the way a guard walks even when his heart is going like a drum, to the small cold cell off the guardroom where the unwed men of the watch sleep, and I drew the bolt, and I sat on the edge of my cot, and I broke the dead queen's seal. Inside were 2 things. The first was a single sheet of paper, folded once, covered in a hand I knew, the late queen's own writing, grown shaky in her last years but unmistakable, the long looping capitals she had never lost. The second, folded smaller and tucked inside the first, was a map. I read the letter first, I have it still. I could recite it in the dark, and on the worst nights of that month I did. Corin, it began, with no title and no ceremony, the way she had always spoken to me. If Hesper has kept her word, then I have been 3 years gone and you are reading this alone, which is how I wished it. I am sorry to reach for you out of the ground. I would not if there were another I trusted as I trust you. There is a thing beneath this palace that I have kept shut my whole reign, and that my father kept shut before me, and his mother before him. It is old and it is dangerous, and the danger of it is precisely that everyone has forgotten it is there. I could not destroy it without telling someone why, and the telling would have done more harm than the thing itself. So I kept the secret and I kept the watch, and now I am dead and the watch falls to you because you are the only soul in this house who will neither sell it nor boast of it nor be charmed into looking away. Follow the map. Go alone. Go slowly. Tell no one until you have seen with your own eyes what I am asking you to guard. And Corin, when you have seen it, you will be tempted to think the danger long past. Do not. The thing that is forgotten is the thing that waits. Watch the quiet door. It was signed only with the tower and the candle, drawn small in her own hand beneath the words. I sat in that cold cell with the letter on my knee and the map unopened in my fingers, and I will not pretend I felt anything but fear, not for myself. I had stopped fearing for myself a long time before. The fear was the older kind, the kind that comes when something far larger than you turns and looks your way and you understand, all at once, that you have been chosen for a thing you cannot give back. The palace was waking up around me. I could hear the kitchen starting, the clatter of the morning, the ordinary enormous noise of a great house coming alive for another day. The young queen somewhere above me rising to her duties, her 2 children asleep behind a nursery door I had walked past 10,000 times and never once thought to truly see. I unfolded the map. It was older than the letter, much older. The paper had gone the brown of weak tea, and along its creases it had worn nearly through, so that I had to spread it on the cot with the care of a man handling a moth's wing. It was not a map of the realm or of the city or of any place I knew. It was a map of the inside of Harrowgate Palace, and not the palace I walked every day. It was the palace beneath the palace. I had served in that house for 20 years. I could have walked it blind. I knew the 4 great wings and the forecourt and the chapel and the kitchens and the long galleries and the cellars beneath the cellars where the old wine slept. And yet the lines on that map showed corridors I had never seen, stairs that descended past the deepest cellar I knew into rooms with no names, and a single long passage, drawn in a darker ink than the rest as though the hand that made it had pressed harder there, running out from beneath the very oldest part of the house, the west wing, the old keep, the part of Harrowgate that had stood before any of the rest of it was built. The dark line ran from there straight as a spear, under the gardens, under the outer court, and ended at a small square the mapmaker had drawn and then circled twice, and beside the circle, in the late queen's shaky late hand, were 3 words, "Here it begins." Begins, not ends. I sat with that word a long time. There were marks all along the route, small and precise, a notch here, a number there, a tiny drawing of a hand pointing at a particular stone, the kind of marks a person leaves who knows that the way is not obvious and that whoever comes after will be alone and afraid in the dark and will need a friend's hand on the path. She had walked it herself then. The old queen in her last years, with her shaky hand and her bad knees, had gone down into that black place alone and walked the whole of it and drawn me the way. I thought of her doing that, a woman past 70, with a lantern and a cane and no one to call if she fell, and something turned over in my chest that I do not have a clean word for. It was grief, and it was love, and it was the beginning of a vow. I did not go that night. I want to be honest about that. A braver man or a more foolish one might have taken a lantern and gone down the moment his watch ended. I did not. I had been a guard too long to go into the unknown unprepared, and more than that, I had read her words, go slowly, go alone, tell no one, and I understood that haste was its own kind of betrayal. Whatever was down there had waited centuries. It would keep 3 more days, while I learned the house above it well enough to come and go without a single soul wondering where Sergeant Vael had got to. So I did what I am good at. I watched. I watched the old West Wing for 3 days, the way I had once watched an unlatched window, and I learned its rhythms. The West Wing was the dead part of the palace, the part the court did not use, too cold, too plain, too haunted by the long ago for a young court that liked its rooms gilded and warm. The royal household lived in the east and south. The West Wing held only the muniment room where the oldest deeds were kept, a chapel no one prayed in, a gallery of dim ancestral portraits, and below all that, behind a door that was always locked, the stair to the lower cellars where nothing was stored anymore but the realm's forgotten centuries. One man had charge of that wing and those cellars. I learned his name on the 2nd day, and I will tell you it now, because everything that followed grew from the fact that he existed and that I had never once, in 20 years, thought him worth a second glance. His name was Lord Mercer Talvin, and he was the warden of the lower works. You will not have heard of such an office, and that is the point of it. The warden of the lower works is the man who keeps the drains and the dry wells and the foundations and the disused cellars of the palace, the bones of the house, the parts no one sees and no one thanks. It is an old office and a small one, the kind of post a minor noble takes when he has a name but no fortune and wants to live at court without being laughed at, and Talvin had held it for 11 years. He was a thin, dry, courteous man of perhaps 50, with gray at his temples and a way of bowing exactly as low as your station required and not a finger's breadth lower, and he was so perfectly forgettable that I had stood within arm's reach of him 100 times and could not, before those 3 days, have told you the color of his eyes. They were gray. I learned that, watching him. Gray and patient and very, very still, the stillness of a man who has trained himself to it, the way I have. Except that mine is the stillness of a man with nothing to hide, and his, I would come to understand, was the other kind. I am getting ahead of the story. On those 3 days I knew none of this. I knew only that the West Wing was quiet, that its lower stair was locked, that the warden of the lower works held the key, and that he made his rounds of the cellars on a fixed schedule. Every 3rd evening, after the supper bell, for about an hour, carrying a ring of old iron keys and a covered lantern, and that he went down alone and came up alone and spoke to no one, and that in 11 years not one person in that palace had thought it worth wondering what a man does for an hour. 3 evenings out of 9, in the dark under the oldest part of the house. I thought it worth wondering. I had a dead queen's letter in my breast pocket and 3 words burning in my mind, here it begins, and a route that ran from under the old keep straight toward. I now saw when I laid the map against the true plan of the palace in my head, the East Wing. The lived-in wing. The wing where the young queen slept and her children behind their nursery door. On the 4th night I went down. I will set the scene exactly, because the smallest details mattered, and I have learned to mistrust the man who blurs them. It was the night after Talvin's rounds, so that I knew the lower cellars would be undisturbed for 2 full days. I came off the late watch at the second bell of the morning, in the deadest part of the night, and instead of going to my cot, I went to the west wing in my own clothes, not my uniform, with a dark lantern and a coil of waxed cord and a stub of chalk and a short iron bar, and the late Queen's map folded in oilcloth against my heart. The lower stair was locked, as it always was, but a guard who has served 20 years in a great house has learned a few things the household does not advertise, and there are more ways into the bones of an old palace than the one door a warden keeps a key to. I went in by a coal chute behind the disused kitchen of the old keep, a black sloping throat of stone I had marked on my second day of watching, and I came out, filthy and quiet, in a cellar that smelled of cold earth and centuries, and I lit my lantern, and I opened the map. The first marks led true. The knot she had drawn was there in the lintel of a doorway, worn but real, exactly where her hand had put it. The little pointing hand pointed at a stair down, and the stair was there. I went down it. The numbers along the route were the count of steps, I realized. She had counted them for me so that I would know in the dark when each flight ended, and the count was exact, every flight, as though she were a step ahead of me the whole way down, counting under her breath. 20 steps. Then a passage. Then 14 steps. Then a low door, half off its hinges, and beyond it a cellar I am certain no living man but Talvin had entered in 100 years. The air so still it seemed to push back against my breath, the stone weeping a cold sweat, my lantern throwing a small warm world of light into a dark that swallowed it whole. I was now below the deepest cellar I had ever known existed, and the map showed me deeper yet to go. I went on. I will not dress up what it was to walk alone through the underside of that house in the dead of night with nothing but a coin of lantern light and a dead woman's hand drawn on old paper to keep me from the dark. I have stood guard through riots and through state funerals, and through one long night when a fire took the stables, and we feared it would take the whole east face of the palace, and I tell you that none of it frightened me the way that quiet did. There is a particular fear in a place built by men, and then forgotten by them. The walls here were not the dressed and gilded stone of the palace above. They were rough, old, the work of hands 1,000 years dead, fitted without mortar in some places, and the deeper I went the older they grew, until I understood that I had passed out of the palace entirely, and into whatever had stood on that ground before the palace was so much as dreamed. The map called this stretch the Undercroft, and her marks here grew careful, anxious almost, a notch and a pointing hand at nearly every turn, as though she had been afraid even with the way memorized that a man might lose himself down here and never be found. And then the marks stopped at a door. I had been counting on the door for 2 days because she had drawn it large on the map, larger than anything else, and circled it, and written beside it a single word sealed, and I had not known what she meant by that. Now I saw. It was a door of black oak banded in iron, set into the living rock at the end of a short passage that went nowhere else, and it had been shut not with a lock but with something older and graver. Across the seam of it, from frame to frame, ran a band of lead, poured molten long ago and gone hard, and pressed into the lead in 3 places were the same device I had broken on her letter, the tower with the candle in its highest window, the private seal of the house of Harrowgate, the one the queens used for the things that were theirs alone. Someone had closed this door and poured lead across it and stamped the lead with the crown's own seal, so that it could not be opened without the breaking being plain to anyone who came after. It was not a lock to keep a thief out. A lock can be picked in silence. This was a lock that announced itself the instant it was broken. It was a watch set in metal, a way of saying, across the centuries, to whoever the crown next trusted, "If you find this broken, the danger has woken." And it was broken. I crouched and brought the lantern close, and I felt the cold go all through me, because the lead across the bottom of the door had been cut clean with a chisel, and then, this was the thing that turned my stomach pressed back into place, the cut hidden, so that to a careless eye in poor light the seal looked whole. Whoever had done it had even tried to forge the device back into the soft lead with something, a copy of the seal or a clever tool, and had nearly managed it. But lead remembers, and the false stamp sat a hair shallow beside the true ones, and a man on his knees with a lantern and 20 years of looking for the thing that is a hair out of true could not miss it. I knelt there a long while. I want you to understand the size of what that cut meant, because I understood it all at once, kneeling on that cold floor, and the understanding has never left me. It meant the late Queen's seal had been broken after she was buried, for I had seen it whole, or near enough, in her drawing, and her drawing was made in her last year, and the false stamp was bright where the cut went deep, the lead not yet darkened by the same century of damp that had blackened the rest. It meant that in the 3 years she had been gone, someone in that house had come down into this forgotten place, found the sealed door she had trusted to hold, cut it open, and resealed it to hide the crime. It meant the watch she had kept her whole reign had failed within 3 years of her death, failed not to time or decay, but to a living hand, a hand that walked the palace above me still, that perhaps had bowed to me in a corridor that very week, that knew this door was here and knew what lay beyond it, and meant for no one ever to know that it knew. And it meant the late Queen had been right about the only thing she had asked me not to believe. You will be tempted to think the danger long past. Do not. The thing that is forgotten is the thing that waits. I set my iron bar against the cut lead, and I worked it, slow and careful and silent, and I drew the door open into the dark. I did not yet know what I would find on the other side. I knew only that I had crossed the line the dead Queen had drawn, that from this moment I was no longer a man following a map, but a man inside a living secret, and that somewhere above me, asleep or awake, a person I could not yet name had crossed the same line before me and meant to come back. I lifted my lantern, and I stepped through the broken door, and the small warm light fell on the first thing that proved every fear I had carried down those stairs. It was a passage, a true passage, not a cellar, a tunnel cut straight and clean through the rock, taller than a man and wide enough for two to walk abreast, running away from me into a dark my lantern could not reach. The air that came out of it was not the dead, still air of the Undercroft. It moved. There was a draught, faint but real, a breath of cooler air pulling past my face toward some far opening, and a draught means an end somewhere, an exit, a way out into the world. This was not a sealed room the crown had buried and forgotten. This was a road, a hidden road running under the palace, with a mouth at one end I had just come through and a mouth at the other end somewhere I had not yet found. And on the floor of it, in the soft dust of a century, were footprints. Not old, not the smeared, settled marks of long ago. Fresh footprints, the dust kicked into little ridges still standing where a boot had pressed it, 2 lines of them, one going away into the dark and one coming back, the prints of a man who had walked this passage and returned, and not once, many times. The prints overlapped and crossed, dozens of them, the patient repeated traffic of a man who had made this his road. And at one place near the door someone had set down a lantern and let the wax drip, and the wax was pale and clean and could not have been there above a few weeks. I want to tell you that I went straight down that tunnel to its far end. I did not. The first lesson the late Queen had drilled into me without ever meaning to teach a lesson at all was patience, and the first thing a guard learns is that you do not walk into a dark you have not measured. I stood at the broken door and I looked at what was before me, and I made myself think instead of move, because a frightened man moves and a useful man thinks, and I had decided somewhere on those stairs that whatever this was, I would be useful and not merely frightened. So I read the floor. The footprints told me a man came in by this door, by Talvin's door, by the route I had taken, and walked the tunnel to its far end and came back. The wax told me he carried his own light. The draught told me the far end opened somewhere. And the worn band of the prints, the way they kept to the center of the passage and never wandered, told me he knew exactly where he was going and was not exploring but using. This was not a discovery. To the man who made these prints, this was a habit. I knelt and marked in my mind the size of the boot. A long, narrow foot, a gentleman's boot, not a laborer's. I marked the length of the stride, which was a tall man's. I marked that the prince carried no second set, no helper, no servant. The man came alone every time, which told me the secret was his and his only, too dangerous even to share with the men who fetch and carry. And then I did the hard thing, the thing my whole body did not want to do. I stepped into the tunnel and I walked it. I counted my paces as I went, the way she had taught me without teaching, and I kept one gloved hand on the cold wall, and I held the lantern low so its light would not blind me to anything ahead, and I went slowly down that long straight throat of stone under the sleeping palace. 80 paces. 100. The draft grew stronger on my face. 140. The walls changed. Here they had been shored up at some point, old timbers gone black, then newer ones, raw pale wood that could not have been a year in place, propping a stretch where the roof had begun to fail, and someone had taken the trouble to make it safe. Someone had been maintaining this road. A man does not shore up a tunnel he means to use once. He shores up a tunnel he means to use again, and soon, and to walk in haste and in the dark when the time comes, with no fear of the roof coming down on the thing he means to do. At 210 paces the tunnel turned, and at 240 it began to climb, a long shallow ramp rising back toward the surface, and I understood that I had walked the whole length of the dark line on the map, out from under the old keep, under the gardens, under the outer court, and that I was now climbing up toward its other end. The end she had circled, the end she had marked. Here it begins. The draft was a steady, cool river now. I could smell, faint under the cold stone, something green and living, garden air, and then the ramp ended at a short flight of worn steps, and the steps ended at a low arch, and the arch was filled by a wall. Not a door. A wall, a panel of stone, fitted so neatly into the arch that from the tunnel side I might have thought it the natural end of the passage, except that down one edge of it ran a hairline seam, and set into the seam, at the height of a man's shoulder, was a small iron lever worn bright by use. I did not touch it. I am glad now that I did not touch it, because I did not yet know where it opened, and a guard does not open a door into a room he cannot see. Instead, I put my eye to the hairline seam, and I waited for my sight to clear, and through it, very faint, I saw light, not lantern light, but the soft gray of the world above, the false dawn beginning, coming in around the edges of the panel from the room on the other side. And I heard, far off and overhead, the first stirrings of the house waking. And then, nearer, much nearer, just on the far side of that stone, I heard the small particular sound that stopped my heart in my chest and held it stopped, because I knew that sound, I would have known it anywhere in the world. I heard a child laugh. It was a small laugh, sleepy and sudden, the laugh of a little one waking happy in a warm bed, and then a second higher, a girl's, and the soft murmur of a nurse hushing them, and the ordinary blessed morning sounds of the royal nursery, where the Princess Maelin, who was 8, and the Prince Joran, who was 10, slept every night of their lives behind a door I and my fellows guarded with our bodies and our honor, a door at the front of which we stood our watch, certain that the only way to those children was past us. And here was a man's tunnel, freshly walked, freshly shored, climbing up out of the forgotten dark to a hidden panel with a worn iron lever, opening into the nursery wing, behind every guard, behind every locked door, behind every honest sword in that house, into the very rooms where the realm's 2 children slept. I took my eye from the seam. I did not touch the lever. I stood in the dark with the children's laughter coming faint through the stone, and I made myself breathe, slow and even, the way I had trained 10,000 mornings on the wall, and I understood with a clarity that has never since left me that the late Queen had not sent me down here to guard a buried thing. She had sent me down here to guard her grandchildren. I went back the way I had come. I will not pretend the walk back was not the longest of my life. Every pace of that 240 I spent fighting the part of me that wanted to run up the tunnel, out into the house, to wake the captain, to throw a cordon around the nursery, to drag every guard in Harrowgate out of his bed and stand a wall of steel between those children and the dark. That is what a frightened man does. That is what a brave fool does. And I had read the dead Queen's letter, and I knew it would be the worst thing I could do. Think on it with me, the way I made myself think on it in that tunnel. The man who walked this road came and went unseen. He resealed a door behind him to hide that it had ever been opened. He had not in 3 years used the panel at the end. The children laughed on the far side of it, alive and well. Whatever he meant to do, he had not yet done it, which meant he was waiting. Waiting for what I did not know, a night, an order, a price, a signal. But waiting men can be watched, and waiting men can be caught in the act, and the one thing that would ruin everything was to let him know, by so much as a single misplaced guard or a single whispered word, that his road had been found. If I raised the alarm, he would simply never come again. He would melt back into the courteous gray nothing of the warden of the lower works, and the tunnel would be there still, known to him, forgotten by us, and 1 year or 5 years or 20 years on, when the watch had slackened again, he or some heir of his secret would walk it once more. The late Queen had told me the truth of it in a garden long ago, and I had not listened. The danger is the quiet door no one remembers. You do not slam a quiet door. You sit in the dark beside it, and you wait for the hand that comes to open it, and you take that hand. So I went up out of the dark, and I drew the broken lead door shut behind me, and I pressed the cut lead back into its place exactly as he had left it, so that he would find it as he had left it, and never know that a second man had passed. I climbed back through the coal chute and out into the gray morning, filthy and cold and changed, and I went to my cot, and I lay there as the bells rang the house awake, and I did not sleep, and I began, in the plain and patient way that is the only way I know, to build the case. Because that, I had decided, was the thing, not a sword, a case. The late Queen had not asked me to kill a man in the dark. She had asked me to guard the crown, and the crown is not guarded by murder in cellars, but by truth brought into the light where it cannot be denied. If I went to the captain with a story of tunnels and footprints, I would be a sergeant who had broken into the foundations against every standing order, accusing a lord of the realm of a crime there was no proof he had committed, and the most likely end of it was that I would be quietly retired and the lord, warned, would vanish his secret forever. No, I needed it whole. I needed to know who he was and what he waited for and who, if anyone, stood behind him, and I needed it provable, and then I needed to take him at the door in the act, with the proof in his hands, so that there could be no charm and no denial and no quiet burial of the matter. The late Queen had kept this secret 40 years by being patient. I would keep her watch the same way. I started with the warden himself, because I was nearly sure and I needed to be wholly sure. Over the next 9 days I learned Lord Mercer Talvin the way I had once learned an unlatched window, not by asking after him, which would have set tongues moving, but by watching, which sets nothing moving at all. I learned that he had come to court 11 years before, a younger son of a faded northern house with a great name and an empty purse, the kind of man the court is full of, owed a place by his blood and given the smallest one that blood could claim. The wardenship of the lower works, the bones of the house. A nothing post that no one envied and no one watched, and I came to see that this was not the misfortune it appeared but the very thing he had wanted, because a man who means to walk the dark under a palace could ask for no better gift than to be made its lawful keeper, with a ring of keys and a reason to go down, and a certainty that no one would ever ask him why. He was careful. Lord, he was careful. In 9 days I caught him in not one slip a careless watcher would have seen. He bowed correctly. He paid his small bills on time. He dined low at the long tables and laughed at the right jokes and was, to all the court, a dull and harmless man whom no one would have thought of twice. But I was not a careless watcher, and there were things. He went down to the cellars on his fixed rounds, yes. But twice in those 9 days he went down again, off his schedule late, when he thought the house asleep, and came up an hour later with the knees of his dark hose dusted pale where a man kneels at a low door, and brushed clean before he reached the lit corridors, but not clean enough. He received, every few days, a letter that came not by the common post but by a private hand, a thin man in plain travel clothes who came to the tradesman's gate and asked for no one and was gone again within the hour. And Talvin read those letters alone and burned them, every one in his own grate, where a servant would normally do the fires. And once, only once, I saw the courteous gray mask slip. A page brought word at supper that the young queen had ordered the old muniment room in the west wing opened and aired, that her clerks might search the ancient deeds for some matter of a boundary in the north. A small thing, a nothing. And across the table I saw Lord Mercer Talvin go quite still, the particular stillness I knew because it was my own, and his gray eyes move once to the door and back, and then the mask was on again and he asked the page some dull, courteous question about the dates the clerks would want. But I had seen it. The muniment room was in the west wing. The west wing was his. And the thought of the Queen's people coming and going freely in his quiet end of the house had frightened him for the length of a single breath before he mastered it. That breath was worth more to me than a confession. A guilty man is calm about everything except the one thing. Talvin was calm about everything. He was frightened of the west wing. I had my man. Now I needed his purpose and his master if he had one, and here, for the first time, the case I was building stopped being a thing I could carry alone. I had told no one. 9 days and not a word, not a hint to a single soul, which for a man who lives among other men is its own slow torture. But I had come to the edge of what one man can do. I could not watch the cellars and stand my own posts and shadow Talvin and keep the tunnel and miss nothing, all at once, alone. A man asleep on his feet is a man who slips, and I could not afford to slip. The late Queen had said, "Tell no one until you have seen with your own eyes," and I had seen. The instruction had a limit built into it if I was honest, and I had reached the limit. The question was not whether to trust someone. The question was whom. I chose Tamsin Caro. I have turned that choice over 1,000 times since, and I would make it again. She was young, not yet 2 years on the wall, and that was the first reason. She had come to Harrowgate after the late Queen was already in the ground, which meant whatever rot had got into this house, it had got in before her, and she was clean of it. She had no place at court to protect, no patron to please, no debt to any lord. And she had the one thing I needed more than experience, which was the thing the late Queen had seen in me 20 years before. She watched. I had marked it the day I handed her my post. The gray morning Hesper came to me. Tamsin's eyes never stopped moving, taking the hall, the doors, the angles, the way a born guard's eyes do and a hired one's never quite learned to. She would miss nothing. And she was honest in the plain, unshowy way that does not bend, the kind of honesty that is no use at court, and all the use in the world to a man building a case against a lord. I did not tell her everything at once. I am not a fool. I tested her first in the small ways a careful man tests, a question here, a confidence there, watching to see if any of it traveled back to me twisted. None of it did. So one cold evening at the turn of the watch in the empty armory where the rifles are kept and no one comes after the bells, I shut the door and I told her, all of it. The dead Queen's letter, the map, the coal chute and the counted stairs, the sealed door cut and resealed, the tunnel, the footprints, the shored timbers, the panel with the worn iron lever, and the children laughing on the far side of the stone. I watched her face the whole while, because a man's face when he hears a thing like that tells you everything about him. She did not gasp. She did not glow with the awful excitement some take in another man's danger. She went pale, and then she went very still, not the trained stillness, the deeper one, the one that comes when a young soul understands all at once that the world is more dangerous than it had let itself believe, and that the danger has just become its own to carry. And when I was done, she was quiet a long moment, and then she said the thing that told me I had chosen right. She did not say, "What do we do?" She said, "The children. They've been asleep over that door every night, for 3 years." And her voice shook on it, not with fear for herself, but with a young guard's pure horror at a wrong done to the one she had sworn to keep. And I knew then that I had a second pair of eyes I could trust with my life, and more than my life, with theirs. "For 3 years he's had the road and not walked it to the end," I told her. "He's waiting. Our work is to find out for what, and to be there when he stops waiting." We divided the watch between us after that, quietly, 2 honest soldiers in a house we no longer wholly trusted. Tamsin took the day's side. She had a young woman's gift I lacked, of being underfoot and overlooked, of carrying linens or messages through any corridor in the palace and being no more remarked than the air, and she used it to learn the West Wing's comings and goings, while I slept the little I could, and held my own posts and took the dark hours. We met where we could, the armory, a turn of the cloister, once in the chapel no one prayed in, heads bowed as if at prayer, trading what we had found in whispers under our breath. And slowly, between the two of us, the shape of the thing came clear, and it was worse than a single greedy lord and his secret road. It was Tamsin who found the first thread of the master behind the man. She was in the muniment room, the very room Talvin feared, now open and busy with the Queen's clerks hunting their boundary deeds, and she made herself useful carrying the great ledgers, and in the carrying she read. She had wit enough to know what mattered. Among the old deeds the clerks had pulled was a bundle of the wardenship's own records, the dry accounts of the lower works going back 200 years, and in them, in a hand not 2 years old, were entries that did not belong. Payments out of the household's foundation fund, monies meant for shoring drains and mending walls, payments larger than any repair could swallow, made out not to masons or carpenters, but to names that were no names, sundry labor, materials particular, a private matter of the works, signed off by the warden and countersigned on the largest of them by a second hand, a hand that was not Talvin's, a great looping confident hand that signed itself with a single initial and a flourish, the hand of a man important enough that an initial was all he troubled to give. I knew that flourish. I had seen it 100 times on the orders that came down to the guardroom, on the schedules of the watch, on the very paper that told me where to stand and when. It was the hand of the man who, after the captain, held the keys to the whole order of the palace's safety. It was the hand of the Lord Chamberlain's deputy, the master of the household's own right arm, the officer who set the watches and held the inner keys, and to whom every guard in Harrowgate, myself included, answered, a smooth, beloved, trusted man named Sir Damon Hale. I had to sit down when Tamsin told me. There was a low bench along the muniment room wall, and I sat on it like a man whose legs have gone, and I made myself understand what the second hand meant. Because the moment I understood it, the whole shape of the danger turned over and showed me a face I had not let myself imagine. Talvin was not the master. Talvin was the road. Talvin was a faded lord with a key to the cellars and a price, the kind of man who can be bought to keep a secret and shore a tunnel and wait for a signal. The master was the man whose initial was on the largest payment, and the master was not some outside enemy creeping at the gates. The master was inside the watch. Sir Damon Hale set the rosters. Sir Damon Hale decided which guard stood at which door on which night. Sir Damon Hale held, after the captain, the keys to the inner palace and the trust of the whole house, and was, by every account in 11 years, the most faithful servant the crown possessed, the man who stayed late, who remembered every name, who had wept openly, they said, at the late Queen's funeral, who had given young Queen Saralind in the hard first year of her reign the steady arm of an old hand she could lean on. Everyone loved Sir Damon Hale. The Queen trusted him with the safety of her own children, and that was the whole horror of it, laid bare on a dusty bench. The road under the palace was useless to anyone who could not get a man past the guards at the top of it, and the man who commanded those guards was the very man who had paid to keep the road. Do you see the game now? I saw it then all at once, and it took the breath from me. A hidden tunnel into the nursery is nothing if the nursery is guarded. The man who comes up the panel still steps out into a room with a guard at the door. But the man who sets the watch can arrange, on a chosen night, for that door to be held by a guard who will be drawn away, or who will be young and green and easily sent on an errand, or who will simply, by a roster Sir Damon Hale himself wrote, not be there at all. The tunnel and the rosters were two halves of one key. Apart, each was harmless. Together, they opened the most guarded door in the realm from the inside, in silence, on a night of the plotter's choosing, past every honest sword in Harrowgate, including mine. And then the last and coldest piece fell into place, and I understood why the late Queen had set her watch in lead and stamped it with her own seal and trusted it to no captain and no chamberlain, but only in the end, to a sergeant who answered to no faction and could be charmed by no one. She had known. Not the names. She could not have known the names of men who were children when she set the lead, or who came to court after she was gone. But she had known the shape of it. She had known that the deadliest enemy of a crown is never the stranger at the wall but the trusted hand within, the beloved servant, the man everyone would defend and no one would suspect, and that against such a man the ordinary defenses are worse than useless because he commands them. So she had hidden her last defense outside the chain of command entirely, in the dark, in lead and old paper, and had reached past every officer of the household to put it in the hands of one stubborn, watchful man who would owe his duty to the dead and the children, and to nothing else alive. I had thought, those first days, that she honored me past my deserving. I understood now that she had not chosen me for my virtue. She had chosen me because I was no use to the men I would have to defeat. I could not be promoted by them, or ruined by them, or talked round by them, because I wanted nothing they could give and feared nothing they could take. I was, to Sir Damon Hale and his kind, beneath notice. The late Queen had made a weapon of exactly that. But understanding the game and winning it are two different things, and the more I understood, the harder I saw my road would be. Consider where I stood. I was a sergeant. The man I now believed meant harm to the royal children was the deputy of the household, who could send me anywhere in the realm with a single line of ink, who set the very watch I would need to catch him, and who was loved and trusted by the Queen herself. If I went to the captain answered to Sir Damon Hale. If I went over the captain's head, I went to Sir Damon Hale. If I went to the Queen, a sergeant, with no standing, asking private audience to accuse her most trusted officer of a plot against her children, on the strength of footprints in a cellar and a dead woman's map, I had got by breaking every order in the book. I would be mad, or worse, a tool of some other faction trying to bring Hale down, and the kindest end would be my quiet dismissal, and the unkind end would be that Hale, warned, would move that very night before I could be believed. The case had to be perfect. It had to be so plain, so undeniable, so caught in the act that no charm could explain it and no friendship could excuse it, and the Queen herself, looking at it, could not look away. I needed the tunnel walked and the panel opened by the plotter's own hands, in front of witnesses the Crown could not dismiss, with the proof of the years of planning laid beside it. I needed to take them at the door. Which meant I needed to know the one thing I still lacked, the night. Hale and Talvin were waiting for something. I had to learn what and when, and I had to do it without either of them ever sensing the floor had shifted beneath them. It was a strange double life I led in those next weeks, and I think it aged me more than any year before it. By day I was Sergeant Vael, the same dull, reliable sergeant I had always been, standing my posts, saluting Sir Damon Hale in the corridors with the same level respect I had given him for 11 years, taking my rosters from his hand, and never once letting my eyes hold his a beat too long. He would pass me with a nod and a courteous word. He had a courteous word for every man in the house. That was his genius. And I would think, "You mean to come up out of the dark behind those children?" And I would nod back, and he would never know. I learned in those weeks that the hardest discipline I had ever kept was not standing still under a tourist's jeers or a storm's cold. It was looking into the smiling face of a man who meant murder of the worst and quietest kind, and giving him back nothing but a soldier's blank good service. By night I built the case. Tamsin and I had grown careful as foxes. We never met twice the same way. We wrote nothing down that named a name. I kept the whole of it in my head, which is a thing 20 years of memorizing rosters and faces had fitted me for, and what little we had to record we put in a cipher of Tamsin's devising, a girl's marketing list that meant nothing to any eye but ours. And piece by piece, the purpose came clear, and when it did I understood at last why the plotters had waited 3 patient years with their road dug and ready. They were waiting for the law. I am no scholar of the realm's high statutes, but every guard knows the broad shape of the succession, because the succession is the thing we exist to protect. Queen Saralind reigned. After her, by the ancient law of Eldermoor, the crown passed to her eldest child, the Prince Joran, and after him to the Princess Malin, and the line ran on through them. But the children were young, 10 and 8, and the law of the realm held that should the throne fall to a child, the kingdom would be governed in the child's name by a council of regency until the child came of age, and that the head of that council, the Lord Protector, would hold the whole power of the crown in trust for years and years, until a boy of 10 was a man of 21. 11 years of rule in all but name, for whoever could make himself Lord Protector, and the law named who that would be, in the absence of the Prince Consort, and Prince Consort Aldrich was often abroad on the realm's business, gone months at a stretch on the long embassies. A consort is sent to keep peace with the neighbor kingdoms. The regency would fall to the great officers of the household, foremost among them the master of the household and his deputy. His deputy, Sir Damon Hale. There was a turn of the law coming. Tamsin pieced it out from the clerk's own gossip, and I confirmed it from the Munimantrum deeds. The Prince Consort Aldrich was to depart within the month on the longest embassy of his life, a year and more in the far south, to seal a treaty the realm badly needed, and while he was gone, by a settlement the late king had made and the present queen had renewed, the order of regency stood plain and fixed, with the household's officers at its head. For 1 year, Eldermoor's children would have, between them and a council ruled by Sir Damon Hale, only their mother the queen. I did not let my mind run all the way down that black road, and I will not run it down for you now, because this is a clean account, and there are things a decent man does not set out in plain words even to condemn them. I will say only what the cold arithmetic of it was, the arithmetic the plotters had surely done in some quiet room 3 years before, with a map of the cellars spread before them. A queen is hard to harm. She is grown and guarded and clever and beloved. But a crown can be unmade other ways than at its head, by men patient enough and cold enough, and a regency is a prize worth a long and dreadful patience. The tunnel was not dug to harm a queen. It was dug to reach, in silence and unseen, the small lives that stood between a faithless servant and 11 years of stolen power, and whatever the plotters intended for those lives, whether to spirit them away into the dark and out the far mouth of that road and the world's wide places where no searcher would ever look, or worse, the purpose was the same. To remove the children from the board, quietly, by a road no guard watched, on a night no roster covered, while the only parent who could not be fooled or moved aside was 100 leagues to sea. That was the night they waited for, the Prince Consort sailing, and it was 3 weeks away. I want to be very plain about what I felt, learning that, because it is the heart of this whole account, and the thing the late queen had reached out of the ground to make me promise. I felt the pull, stronger than I have ever felt anything, to throw the rosters in the fire and run to the queen and the captain and the whole armed strength of the house and end it that hour. The children were 3 weeks from a hidden door and a patient murderer's road. Every soldier's instinct in me screamed to draw steel and stand between, and I held. God knows what it cost me, but I held because I knew, with the cold certainty the late queen had given me, that to move too soon was to lose. Hale held the watch and the queen's trust both. Warned he would simply not move. The road would close, the deeds would be burned, Talvin would have an explanation for every shilling, and a sergeant and a green guard would stand accusing the realm's most beloved officer with footprints and a marketless cipher, and we would be broken, and the road would still be there waiting for the next year the consort sailed, or the year after, world without end. The only way to save those children forever was to take the men who threatened them in the very act, with the proof so complete the crown could not blink. The only way to win was to let them walk up that tunnel one last time and be waiting at the top. It was the hardest thing I have ever set myself to do, and there were nights I doubted I could do it. But I had the dead queen's word for it, and I had Tamsin's clear young eyes holding mine across a chapel pew, and I had 3 weeks, and a plan was beginning at last to take shape in the dark. I should tell you what those weeks did to us, because it is part of the truth of this account, and because the cost of restraint is the thing the loud men never reckon. It is one thing to stand still under a tourist's jeers for an hour, the discipline of that I had mastered long ago. It is another thing entirely to carry murder in your knowledge for 3 weeks and do nothing, to wake each morning beside the danger, to salute its author in the corridor, to watch 2 children you have sworn your body to walk laughing past the very wall their death was hidden behind, and to hold your hand day after day, because moving too soon would doom them. That is a weight that does not show. No one saw it on me. I stood my posts as straight as I ever had, and not one man in the guardroom guessed that the dull, reliable Sergeant Vael was being slowly hollowed out by the thing he carried. But it was hollowing me out. I stopped eating much. I slept in snatches, and what sleep I got was thin and full of dark corridors. My hands, which had never shaken in 20 years, shook sometimes when I was alone, and I would set them flat against the cold stone of my post until they stilled. It was worse for Tamsin, and I watched it be worse for her, and there was nothing I could do but stand beside her in it. She was young. She had not yet built the long callous a man builds over the years against the knowledge that the world holds men like Sir Damon Hale. To her, it was still a fresh wound that a man could weep at a grave and smile at a queen and mean, the whole while, to carry her children into the dark for the sake of 11 years of power. I found her once in the chapel that no one prayed in, not praying, only sitting in the dim with her hands knotted in her lap, and I sat down beside her and neither of us spoke for a long while, and at last she said very low, "How do you bear it, Sergeant?" Knowing and saying nothing and just standing there. And I thought about how to answer her honestly, because she deserved an honest answer and not a soldier's slogan, and what I said was the truest thing I knew. "You bear it by remembering what the bearing is for," I said. "Every hour I say nothing is an hour closer to the night we take them in the act and end it forever instead of frightening them off to try again in 5 years. The silence is not weakness, Tamsin. It is the hardest blow we will ever strike, and we are striking it right now, every hour by holding still. The late Queen held this watch 40 years and never once got to draw a sword. She held it by standing still. That is what we are doing. We are standing still on purpose, with everything in us screaming to move, because standing still is the only thing that wins." She looked at me a while, and something in her young face settled, hardened in the good way, the way a blade is tempered, and she nodded, and she did not ask me again. From that night she carried it better. Not easily. Better. And I came to understand that the late Queen had not only handed me a watch. She had handed me, without meaning to, the teaching of the one who would keep it after me, and that the teaching was not done with words, but with the example of a man holding his hand when every nerve in him wanted to draw. There is one more thing I learned in those weeks, and it belongs here because it is the marrow of the whole matter. I had always thought of my discipline as a wall, a thing that kept the storm out, that let the jeers and the cold and the long hours break against it and leave me unmoved. I learned in those 3 weeks that discipline is not a wall. A wall is passive. It only endures. What I was doing was not enduring. It was the most active thing I have ever done in my life. Every hour I chose, again, freshly, against every instinct, not to raise the alarm. Every salute I gave Sir Damon Hale was a deliberate act of war disguised as obedience. The stillness the world mistakes for nothing was in truth the hardest labor a man can perform, the holding of a drawn bow at full tension for 3 weeks without letting fly, and I have never since let any man tell me in my hearing that the guard who only stands and watches does nothing. He does the hardest thing there is. He waits. But I had the dead queen's word for it, and I had Tamsin steadied at my side, and the plan was taking shape, and the days were running down toward the night. The plan was simple, the way the strongest plans are. I would not breathe a word to the captain, or to any officer in Hale's chain, not one. But a sergeant who has served 20 years in a great house knows men outside the chain, and there was one I trusted above all others, an old comrade from the years before I came to Harrowgate, a hard, quiet man named Garin Wick, who had risen by his own honest worth to command the Queen's riders, the mounted troop that answered not to the household at all but to the crown direct, to the Queen's own person, and to no chamberlain or steward living. Garin owed nothing to Sir Damon Hale, and feared nothing from him. If I could lay the whole case before Garin, and if Garin believed me, then on the chosen night I would have, ready and hidden, a force of honest swords that Hale did not command and could not call off, men to take the plotters at the panel in the act, and witnesses of rank the crown could not dismiss. And once we had them with the proof in their hands, I would go to the Queen, not as a lone sergeant with a story, but as the man who had laid the trap her own grandmother set and sprung it on her children's enemies. That was the plan. It needed only time and patience, and that nothing go wrong in the 3 weeks. Something went wrong in the 2nd week. It came, as the worst things do, through no fault of mine, by a kindness. The young Queen, who loved her children past all reason and feared for them in the ordinary loving way of mothers, took a sudden fright one evening, a small thing, a window left open in the nursery that a careless maid had not latched, a draught, a child's bad dream, and in her fright she did what any loving mother and any good queen would do, which was the one thing that nearly undid us all. She summoned Sir Damon Hale, her most trusted officer, the keeper of her household safety, and she told him she was uneasy for her children, and she ordered him to see the nursery wing made wholly secure. Every door, every window, every passage searched and sealed, every weakness found and stopped, before the prince consort sailed and left her alone. You will see the trap of it at once, because I saw it the instant Tamsin brought me the word, white-faced, having heard it from a chambermaid. The Queen, meaning only love, had handed the search of the nursery wing to the very man who had bought the road beneath it. Sir Damon Hale was now ordered by the crown itself to go through that wing stone by stone, which meant that within days, lawfully, openly, with the Queen's own blessing, his men would come to the place where the hidden panel opened, and either they would find it, or, far more likely, he would let them find nothing while he quietly, under cover of the very search meant to stop him, did the last work the road needed, and learned that his secret was still his. And there was a worse edge to it yet, the edge that turned my blood to water. If Hale's men searched the nursery wing thoroughly enough to find the panel, they would find it had been opened, and they would find, in the dust of the tunnel below, 2 sets of footprints where there should have been 1. They would find that someone other than Talvin had walked that road. They would know they were not alone in the secret. And then Sir Damon Hale, the patient, careful murderer, would understand that he was watched, and he would not wait for the consort to sail. He would move at once, or he would close the road and vanish it and bide his time for years. And either way, every patient week I had spent, every hour of Tamsin's danger, the whole of the dead Queen's last hope, would be lost in a single night. I had a day, perhaps 2, before Hale's search reached the panel, and I made in that day the hardest choice of the whole affair, harder than holding my hand for 3 weeks, because it meant doing the thing I most feared, going down into the dark not to watch but to act, and risking everything on a single quiet gamble. I went down the tunnel one last time, alone, by the coal chute, in the deepest hour of the night, with Tamsin keeping the way behind me. And I did 3 things. First, I went to the long stretch of fresh footprints, mine and Talvin's both, and with a soft broom of bound twigs I swept the whole floor of the tunnel clear, every print, his and mine alike. And then I walked it once more in Talvin's own manner, in a borrowed pair of his measure that Tamsin had got from the laundry and would return before dawn, laying down a single clean set of prints, one man's, going and coming, so that any searcher would find exactly what the warden of the lower works could explain, that he, the lawful keeper of the cellars, had walked his own foundations, as was his right and his duty. Second, at the panel itself, I did not touch the lever, but I studied the stone around it by lantern light until I found what I had hoped to find, that the panel, from the nursery side, sat behind a great old tapestry in a disused corner of an anteroom, a corner no one used and no searcher would think twice about, and that the lever's catch, here on the tunnel side, could be quietly fixed so that the panel would still open to a hard practiced push from below, but would resist any idle pressure from above, so that Hale's searchers, if they ever pressed that wall at all, would find it solid stone and pass on. And third, this was the gamble, the thing I prayed over kneeling in the dark. I left the sealed lead door at the tunnel's other end exactly, precisely as Talvin had left it, the cut pressed back, the false stamp in its place, untouched and undisturbed, so that when Hale came down to do his own quiet work under cover of the search, he would find his road just as he had left it, his secret kept, his confidence whole. I gambled everything on his never knowing he was found. I gave the murderer back his certainty, so that he would walk into my trap believing he walked into his own. I came up at dawn filthy and shaking and emptied out, and I did not know if I had saved us or doomed us, and for 3 days I could not sleep for waiting to learn which. On the 3rd day Sir Damon Hale reported to the Queen, with his courteous smile and his beloved steady voice, that the nursery wing had been searched stone by stone and was wholly secure, that no weakness remained, that Her Majesty might rest easy and bid the Prince Consort sail with a quiet heart. And the Queen thanked him with tears in her eyes for the comfort of it, and trusted him more than ever, and never knew that the man bowing before her had just confirmed, with his own search, that his road into her children's rooms was still his and his alone. We had survived, the gamble had held, but I understood, lying awake that night, that I had also done a terrible thing. I had let the last warning pass. There would be no more searches. The Queen believed her children safe. The consort would sail, and from this night the only thing standing between the Princess Malin and the Prince Joran and the dark road beneath their beds was a sergeant, a green guard, and an old comrade I had not yet even dared to approach, and the dead Queen's map, folded in oilcloth against my heart. I went to Garin Wick the next morning. I had put it off long enough, and the putting off had been its own discipline, for the more men who knew a secret the sooner it dies. But I could not spring the trap with 2 pairs of hands, and the night was coming, and I had run out of reasons to wait. I found him at the riding yard beyond the outer court, where the Queen's riders kept their horses, a place no household officer had cause to go, and I asked him plainly for an hour of his time on a matter of the Queen's safety, soldier to soldier, and Garin Wick, who had known me 20 years and never once heard me ask for anything, looked at my face, and took me into the small bare room where the troop kept its tack and shut the door. I told him all of it. It took the better part of that hour. I am not a man who tells things twice, so I told it once in order, plainly, the way I have told it here. The dead Queen's letter and the map, the coal chute and the counted stairs, the sealed door cut and resealed, the tunnel and the panel and the children's laughter, the footprints and the fresh-shored timbers, the payments in the muniment ledgers and the second hand that signed them, the law of the Regency and the consort sailing, the Queen's well-meant order, and the search that had nearly undone us, and the gamble I had made to keep the murderer's confidence whole. And Garin Wick listened to the end without a word, his hard, weathered face giving nothing, and when I was done he was silent a long while, looking at the floor, and I thought, he does not believe me, and I felt the whole thing slipping away. Then he said, "Lo, Sir Damon Hale stood beside the Queen at the late Queen's funeral and wept like a son." He looked up at me. "And you are telling me he means to murder her children for a regency?" "I am telling you what I have seen with my own eyes," I said. "The tunnel is real. I have walked it. The panel opens behind the tapestry in the nursery anteroom, and the lever is worn bright with use. The footprints are real. The payments are real, and his hand is on them. I cannot tell you what is in his heart. I can tell you the road runs into the children's rooms, and a man has kept it ready for 3 years, and the only night that makes sense of it all is the night the consort sails. You have known me 20 years, Garin. Have you ever once known me to raise a false alarm, or to want a thing I should not have, or to be charmed by a man who wished me to look away?" And Garin Wick, who had once stood beside me on a wall through a long bad night, and had reason to know exactly what manner of man I was, looked at me for a long moment, and then he said the words that saved the lives of 2 children and the honor of a crown. He said, "No, I have not." "What do you need?" "I will tell you what we did, plainly and without flourish, because the late Queen's last gift to the realm was won not by cleverness, but by patience and discipline, and a few good men keeping faith, and that is a thing worth setting down exactly. We did not enlarge the secret. Garin and I agreed on that before all else. The more men who knew, the surer Hale would learn of it, for a household is a sieve, and a faithless officer hears everything. So we chose 3. Garin himself, one rider he trusted as he trusted his own arm, a steady man named Oslin who had served the crown direct for 15 years and owed the household nothing, and Tamsin, who had earned her place in this 100 times over and would not have stood aside for any order living. 5 of us then against a lord, a warden, and whatever men they had bought, and the late Queen, reaching from the ground, and the children themselves, asleep and unknowing, the whole weight of whose small lives lay on the thing we now meant to do. The plan was the tunnel turned against its makers. We knew the road. We knew the panel. We knew near enough the night. So we would wait at the top, not in the nursery itself, which the children must never know was ever in danger, but in the disused anteroom behind the great tapestry where the panel opened. We would be there, hidden, every night from the eve of the consort sailing onward in shifts, 2 of us at a time in the dark behind that tapestry, with the children sleeping safe beyond the inner door, and a guard Garin trusted set quietly on the corridor outside. And when the panel opened, if the panel opened, we would take whoever came up through it, in the act in silence, with the proof of the open road behind them and witnesses of the crown's own troop to swear to every word of it. And the next morning I would go to the Queen, with Garin Wick of the Queen's riders at my side to vouch for me, and lay the whole of it before her, caught and proven, so that no charm and no friendship and no beloved weeping face could ever explain it away. The Prince Consort Aldrich sailed on a bright cold morning at the turn of the month. I stood my post at the forecourt as the household gathered to see him off, the Queen with her 2 children at her side, the Princess Malin holding her father's hand, and crying the way small ones cry at partings, the Prince Joran standing very straight and trying to be a man about it, and Sir Damon Hale just behind the Queen's shoulder, smiling his steady, kind smile, the very picture of the faithful servant left to guard all that the consort loved. I watched Hale's face as the ship's sails filled and the consort's barge pulled out into the gray water, and I saw, only I would have seen it, only a man who had spent a month learning to read that careful mask, I saw the smallest easing in him, the loosening of a man who has waited a long time and sees, at last, the door of his patience beginning to open. The board was set the way he had wanted it for 3 years. The one piece he feared was gone to sea. He thought himself, now, alone with the game. He did not know that across the forecourt, blank-faced in a red tunic, stood the one piece the late Queen had hidden where he would never look. That night the waiting began. There is a particular agony to lying in wait in the dark for a thing that may not come, and we knew it well by the 4th night. We took our shifts behind the great tapestry in the anteroom, 2 at a time, in a silence so complete I could hear the children's nurse turn in her sleep 2 rooms away. We did not speak. We did not move. We breathed slow and kept our eyes on the patch of darker dark that was the panel, and we waited, hour upon hour, night upon night, while a part of me began to whisper the doubter's poison, that I had read it wrong, that there was no plot, that I had dragged Garin Wick and his riders into a fool's vigil over an old warden's harmless rounds, that I would have to live the rest of my days as the sergeant who cried wolf at the household's most beloved officer. Discipline is the thing that holds a man through the 4th night and the 5th, when the fear has worn off and only the doubt remains. I held to it because the late queen had held to her watch for 40 years with far less proof than I had, and because each night when the doubt was worst, I had only to picture the Princess Malin's hand in her father's at the quayside to find the bottom of my resolve again. It was the 6th night. I was behind the tapestry with Garin Wick in the blackest hour, the candle stub in its shielded dish throwing barely light enough to see his hand, when I felt it before I heard it, a breath of cooler air, the draft of the tunnel changing, the way a room changes when a far door opens. I touched Garin's arm. We went still as the stone itself. And then, faint and slow and infinitely careful, came the sound I had waited 6 nights and 3 weeks and 3 years of another's watch to hear, the soft grinding catch of the iron lever, and the whisper of the stone panel swinging in on its old pivot, and a thread of lantern light, hooded low, sliding into the anteroom from the throat of the dark beneath the palace. A man came up out of the floor. He came carefully, a lantern in one hand turned almost dark, the other hand braced on the stone, a tall man in plain dark clothes with his face muffled, and he stood a moment in the anteroom listening, and I knew the stride and the height of him even muffled, for I had studied his footprints for a month. It was Lord Mercer Talvin, warden of the lower works. He stood listening, and hearing nothing, he turned and put his hand back down into the open panel and helped a second man up out of the dark. And the second man straightened, and put back the hood from his face to see better in the dim, and the low light caught the steady, beloved, courteous features of Sir Damon Hale. I have stood guard a long time, and I have schooled my heart to a stone, but I will not pretend that the sight of him there, in the dark, come up the murderer's road into the children's wing with his own 2 hands, did not move me to a cold I have never felt before or since. He carried a leather satchel slung close against his body. He carried in his belt the things I will not describe, the quiet tools of a quiet crime, and at his shoulder, kept low, was a small file I would later learn held a draft meant to keep 2 sleeping children sleeping through what was to be done. For the plan, we would prove, was to take them, not to harm them in their beds, to carry them down the road and out the far mouth and away into the dark of the world, so that they would simply be gone by morning, vanished from a wing sworn secure. And a grieving regency would settle on the realm. He had a man waiting, we would learn, at the tunnel's far mouth, with horses. He had thought of everything. He had thought of everything except that the dead queen had thought of him first. The 2 of them moved toward the inner door, toward the children, with the soft certainty of men who had walked this in their minds 100 times. And I let them clear the panel, I let them come 3 full steps into the room, away from the dark mouth and the chance of bolting back down it. And then I stepped out from behind the tapestry into the thread of their own lantern light, and I said, very low and very level, the only words I had prepared, the words I had carried for 3 years and a month. Watch the quiet door. I will not make a battle of what followed, because it was not one, and the making of battles out of quiet duties is the cheap trick of lesser tellers. Talvin dropped his lantern and lunged for the panel, and Garin Wick took him before his hand touched the stone, took him hard and silent and bore him to the floor with a rider's strength, and Oslin was there from the shadow on the far side, and between them the warden of the lower works was face down and pinned with his arm twisted up his back before he had drawn the breath to cry out. Sir Damon Hale did not lunge. He was a colder man than that and a quicker, and for one heartbeat his hand went to his belt, and I was on him in that heartbeat. And I am a large man and a trained one, and he was a courtier of 50. And I took his wrist and turned it, and the thing in his hand fell to the floor. And I bore him back against the wall and held him there with my forearm across his chest, not striking him, not harming him, only holding him immovable. The way I had held my post against 10,000 storms, while Tamsin came out of the dark with the cord and bound first one wrist and then the other behind him. It was over in the time it takes to tell it. 5 honest soldiers and a hidden door and 3 years' patience, and not one cry raised, not one child woken, not one drop of blood spilled on the floor of the wing where the realm's children slept on, warm and dreaming and never to know, please God, how near the dark had come. I held Sir Damon Hale against the wall and looked into his face by the light of Talvin's fallen, guttering lantern, and the beloved mask was gone at last, fallen away like the hood, and what was under it was nothing at all, no rage, no shame, no plea, only the flat gray emptiness of a man who has wanted power so long and so coldly that there is nothing left in him but the wanting. He looked at me without fear, the way such men look, measuring even now whether I could be bought or threatened or talked round, and he said in his steady, courteous voice, "You are a sergeant. You are nothing. No one will believe you." And I said, "I am nothing. That is why she chose me." And I let Garin Wick of the Queen's Riders, who answered to the crown and to no household officer living, step into the lantern light where Hale could see his face and the badge of the troop on his breast, and I watched the last certainty go out of the murderer's gray eyes as he understood all at once that the men holding him did not answer to him, had never answered to him, that the road he thought his own had been known for a month, that the search he had crowed over to the Queen had been a trap, and that the one piece the dead Queen had hidden where he would never think to look had been standing across the forecourt, watching him smile as the consort sailed. He said nothing after that. There was nothing for such a man to say. We did the rest in order and in silence, as we had planned. Oslin went down the tunnel with 2 more of Garin's men, summoned quietly by a signal arranged days before, and at the far mouth, which we now learned came out cunningly, in a disused ice house in the kitchen gardens, behind a false wall a careless eye would never question. They took the man waiting with the horses, took him before he understood his masters were not coming, and the whole of the road, from the sealed lead door to the far mouth, was in honest hands before the night was an hour older. Talvin and Hale and their hired man were given over to Garin's riders and held in the riding yard, apart from the household entirely, where no friend of Hale's could reach them and no warning could be carried, under guard of men who answered only to the crown. And then I sat down on the floor of the anteroom, behind the great tapestry in the dark where I had waited 6 nights, and I found that I was shaking, and I let myself shake, for the first time in a month, now that it was safe to. Tamsin sat down beside me. We did not speak for a while. Through the inner door, faint, I could hear the slow, even breathing of 2 sleeping children who would wake in the morning to an ordinary day, who would never know, who must never know, how near the dark had come to their door. After a time Tamsin said, very low, she never woke, the princess, she never even woke, as though she could not quite believe a thing so enormous could pass over a sleeping child and leave her dreaming. And I said, that is the whole of it, that she never woke, that is what we were for. And I understood, saying it, that I had finally learned the thing the late Queen had tried to teach me in a garden long ago, that the highest work of a guard is the disaster that never happens, the cry that is never raised, the mourning that comes ordinary because someone stood in the dark all night so that it could. There is no glory in it. There is no crowd to see. The children wake and laugh and never know your name. That is the work. The late Queen had done it for 40 years and gone to her grave with no one but Hesper, and a folded map to show she had ever done it at all. I went to the Queen at the first bell of the morning. I will not set down the whole of that audience, for much of it is the crown's own business and not mine to spread, but I will tell you its shape, because it is the resolution of everything, the place where the dead queen's secret came at last into the light where it could no longer be denied. Garin Wick stood beside me in the badge of the Queen's Riders, and that was the thing that opened the door. For a sergeant alone she would not have seen, but the captain of her own troop, grave and certain, asking private audience on a matter of her children's lives, she could not refuse. We laid it all before her, the map, the letter in the late Queen's own hand, with the tower and the candle drawn beneath it, and the young Queen wept to see her grandmother's writing and pressed it to her, and I think the letter alone half persuaded her before we had said a word, for she knew that hand and knew it would not lie. The tunnel, the footprints, the payments in the ledgers and Hale's own flourish upon them. And then the men themselves, brought from the riding yard under Garin's guard, Talvin, who broke at once and told everything in a babbling rush to save his own neck, the whole 3 years of it, the digging and the shoring and the waiting. And Hale, who told nothing, who stood before the Queen he had served 11 years with his flat gray empty eyes and said not one word in his defense, because there was none, and because, I think, he could not bear to plead to a woman he had thought beneath his game. The Queen looked at Sir Damon Hale for a long while. She had wept at the letter, but she did not weep now. She had loved him, or believed she had. She had trusted him with her children's lives. He had stood at her side and wept at her grandmother's grave. And now she looked at him and she saw, as I had seen in the lantern light, that there had never been anything behind the kind steady mask but the cold wanting, and her face, as she understood it, went from grief to something harder and cleaner, the look of a queen who has just learned exactly how near she came to losing everything and exactly who saved it. She did not rage at him. She was her grandmother's blood, and she had the same iron under the warmth. She said only, in a voice gone very quiet and very level, "You came up out of the floor, into my children's room, with this." And she looked at the file on the table between them, the thing meant to keep 2 children sleeping while they were carried into the dark. And Sir Damon Hale said nothing, and that nothing was his whole confession, and the Queen turned her back on him, which for such a man who lived on being seen, being trusted, being near the throne, was a sentence crueler than any she could have spoken. What became of them is soon told. There was no public trial, for the Crown judged, rightly I think, that the realm need never know how near it came to so terrible a thing, and that the children most of all must be spared ever learning it. Sir Damon Hale and Lord Mercer Talvin and their hired man were taken, quietly and under the Crown's own guard, to the old fortress on the northern coast where the realm keeps the prisoners it does not speak of. And there, as far as I know, they remain, stripped of name and office and title, forgotten by the world exactly as they had hoped to make 2 children forgotten. And there is a justice in that I do not think any court could have improved upon. The tunnel was not sealed up again with lead and a hidden seal, for the late Queen had taught us all the cost of secrets kept too well. It was open to the light. The Queen had it broken through and filled, every foot of it from the sealed door to the far mouth, with good honest rubble and mortar, so that the road that had waited 1,000 years under the palace would never wait again. And where the hidden panel had been behind the tapestry, there is now only solid wall, and where the ice house held the false back, there is now an open garden shed any gardener may walk into in the plain light of day. The quiet door is gone. There is no quiet door any more. The late Queen would have been glad of it, I think. She kept the secret because she had to. She would have far rather it had never needed keeping. The Queen offered me a captaincy. I want to set that down honestly, because a lesser man telling this tale would end it there, with the reward, the rise, the sergeant made captain by a grateful crown. She offered it to me in private, with tears in her eyes, and she offered Tamsin Carow a place of honor too, and to Garin Wick and his riders the thanks of the crown, and all of that was given and right. But I asked the Queen, with respect, to let me keep my own post. I am not a captain. I have not the gift of command, of moving other men. My gift is the older and lonelier one, of standing still and watching and missing nothing, and a man does that best from the wall, not the chair. The Queen understood. She was her grandmother's blood. She let me keep my post, and she gave me one thing instead that I valued past any captaincy. She gave me leave to keep the late Queen's letter, the one with the tower and the candle drawn beneath it, which I carry still, folded in oilcloth against my heart, and will until I go to join the woman who wrote it. So I am a sergeant yet. I stand my post at the foot of the east stair in the grey hour before the household wakes, the same as I have these 20 years and more, and the Princess Malin and the Prince Joran grow tall and laughing in a wing they believe was always safe, and they do not know my name, and that is exactly as it should be. Now and then on the dawn walk she has taken up since that morning, for she walks the gardens now in the early light, the young queen, the way her grandmother used to. She will pass where I stand, and she will stop, and we will not say much, two tired people who share a secret no one else alive may ever fully know. Once she stopped and looked a long while toward the west wing, toward the old keep and the filled-in dark beneath it, and she said quietly, not really to me, she knew. All those years she knew, and she never told me, and she found a way to keep us safe even from the grave. And I said, she watched the quiet door, Majesty. That was her whole life's work, and no one ever saw her do it. And the Queen was quiet, and then she said, and now you watch it. And I said, yes, Majesty, now I watch it. And she went on into the morning, and I stood my post. That is the whole of it. There was no battle, no glory, no crowd, no name made. A dead queen left a map for a man she trusted, and the man followed it into the dark and found the quiet door and shut it forever and went back to his post. The power in this story, if there is any power in it worth the telling, was never in a sword. It was in the restraint that did not raise the alarm too soon, and the patience that held the line for 3 long weeks, and the vigilance that, 20 years before, noticed one unlatched window in the night and reported it, and so was marked, and so was trusted, and so was ready, when at last it mattered more than anything in the world. The late Queen knew a thing that the loud men of the court never learn. The kingdom is not kept by the swords that are drawn. It is kept by the watch that is never relaxed, by the man who stands still in the dark when no one is looking, by the door that is guarded so faithfully that the danger never comes through it at all. She kept that watch for 40 years and told no one. Now I keep it. And one day, when my eyes grow dim and my legs grow slow, I will find the one among the young guards who watches the way Tamsin watches, the way I once watched, and I will take that one quietly aside, and I will pass on what the dead queen passed to me. Not a map. The map is rubble now, thank God, something better. The watch itself. The knowledge that the danger to a crown is never the loud man at the gate. It is the quiet door no one remembers. Watch the quiet door. I have every day of my life since. I always will.